Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, a Texas woman dies after getting a brain-eating amoeba infection. Ozempic may help to raise your flagpole and make it substantially larger. A rather bad medical take on just what's going on with embryo selection. A satirical take on the ability to deliver medicine in a very, very effective way that, if it was true, would actually be incredibly beneficial. Caffeine has some odd effects on you while you sleep. Emperor penguins are disappearing, and we question if this is regicide or not. A form of LSD fungus found on certain flowers. Apple is, declaring war on AI technology by claiming that these aren't really AI, just very advanced chatbots. And a killer asteroid is likely to hit the moon somewhere in early 2030s. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with a Texas woman who has died after not only being infected by a brain-eating amoeba, but effectively infecting herself with the same brain-eating amoeba. What we're talking about here is a 71-year-old Texas woman who was infected with Morningglory LSD. This is an amoeba that shows up basically throughout the southern parts of America. It's well known to occur. More often you find it in either poorly maintained pools or in some wild water bodies, for example rivers, lakes and so on. But neither of these cases apply here. Instead, the woman was infected by, might be a better way of phrasing it, from water within her recreational vehicle, essentially an RV, or camper van, caravan, whatever you wish to call this.
Waffle House? Yeah. No, man. You're supposed to use that dude's money to buy an RV. What do you want with an RV for? Never mind.
The particular amoeba that infected her was within the water storage tank in that vehicle, which by itself shouldn't have been a problem after all. Getting into the brain is hard, unless, as this woman did, you choose to basically force water up into your nose to try and wash it out. It's called nasal irrigation, without first sterilizing said water. That's what happened here, or at least according to the CDC. And unfortunately, it does end rather unfortunately. She died. That's how we know what's happened. They were able to conduct a sort of autopsy and found that, yeah, this is what's inside her brain and what caused it to fail for all intents and purposes. A failure is not exactly a nice process either. It's something called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. Essentially, your brain becomes inflamed and you die. Partly from it basically being squished by all the inflammation and edema that occurs, and partly because, you do happen to have a brain-eating pathogen in there. So, this is not fun. And it does take up to 18 days to die, which 18 days to die for any reason is really not good. Shifting to news that at least will make men happy, possibly not their partners.
Top 4 answers on the board. Name something you haven't licked in a long time.
We have Ozempic claims. This is not the usual healthcare claims of Ozempic will solve all of your issues. Well, it'll solve some of your issues with this, but not medical issues. In this case, it's that Ozempic is being claimed to increase the size of male members, their second brain, if you will. The probability of this actually being true is fairly low. What we suspect is happening is that the people who are taking Ozempic, primarily for weight loss in this case, are quite literally healthier. And because they're healthier, they are able to better salute the flag, if you will, by, raising the flag itself. And in that case, the extra blood volume, extra health, and so on, it simply means that they're bigger. The sizes do, vary a little bit, but the general claim is about an inch or 2.5 centimeters. Overall, we'd say that this is not a, expected result in terms of you take Ozempic purely for it, or rather it's a fairly predictable side effect. If you were looking at it in other terms, well, this might turn out like Viagra, where Viagra was originally developed to be a blood pressure and heart medication drug, but turns out that it was particularly useful in, well, giving old men who are horny the means of, let's say, satisfying themselves and arguably possibly their partner. In other news that might come from this, although less likely given the need for it, it's selection of embryos are based on certain traits. Now, understand, the bad medical take on this is partly because people are completely misconstruing it, and partly because the actual basic claims are very much bad. There are two elements to this, so we'll go through both of them. First, selecting an embryo just means that you have a better chance of that particular thing occurring. It is very hard to ensure you get certain traits in an embryo. In fact, we would say it's nigh on impossible. Of course, this does assume that you aren't willing to go through multiple pregnancies until you get exactly what you want, but at that point we are actually talking to some extent about eugenics. So that's the first bad take. The second is that simply selecting a particular embryo from the available information isn't eugenics. That's because you're not saying that you'll kill off the other embryos. They will still exist. Oftentimes they may even be donated. Instead, what you are actually taking is the one that you particularly think is going to be to your, let's say, desire or interests. So if you want a child that is going to be an absolute mini-me, like most, say, beauty pageant parents, that's what you're going for. So, no, this is not entirely wrong, but it's also rather inaccurate as well. In related reproductive news, we have teen pregnancy risk. Well, the teens are always at a risk of pregnancy. It's a side effect of being young, horny, and dumb. What is instead relevant from this research is that it appears that, let's say, if you are bi, transsexual, or similar, you have a much higher risk of getting pregnant, it seems. Which is a really bizarre phenomenon. You would think, first of all, that if you're a lesbian, you can't actually get pregnant because your partner, quite literally, lacks genitalia that would allow for the production of the necessary gametes. But if you're bi, well, yes, that is a rather different story. The, let's say, conclusion to the research is that there should be more effort put into targeting those women who are, for example, bi, lesbian, etc., in order to give them a better chance of not getting knocked up, and, thankfully, not having to worry about selection of which particular embryo they want, and then the eugenics therein. The other notable point to this is that they do notice that there is a particular trend amongst those who are, let's say, at greater risk of pregnancy, in that they tended to be bullied and maltreated when they're in their younger years, which could be partly a product of telling everybody that they're bi, trans, or whatever, and partly because people can be somewhat arseholes, particularly if they're younger. It is also important to note that this is not a small study exactly, but it's not a large study either. It's about 7,000 young women, so yes, this is helpful, and particularly given it's a longitudinal study, it might prove more useful. Now, shifting to other health news that's more helpful and more healthful, bad puns will continue. We have a Japanese trend known as, well, walking. Well, no, this is not a Japanese trend. This is actually a trend across the world. People walk because, well, it's relatively healthy for you. It's low impact, and it gets you out of the house. Japanese walking is a little bit different. What they do is they walk intensely for about 3 minutes, and then 3 minutes at a lower intensity. It's essentially high-intensity interval training, or HIIT training, just without the intensity of it. Or not the same sort of intensity. You're not running or similar. What is useful about this is that you are effectively getting some of the same benefits as high-intensity training, but without the impact on your body. To use a rough example, if you're an elderly individual, this is very good, because, well, osteoporosis and broken bones aren't good. The evidence in favor of it basically boils down to that, though. That is, you get better fitness from doing this, and because it's a relatively, let's say, expeditious process, or expeditious process, you can get all the benefits in a short time, about 30 minutes. Now, the other noteworthy thing here is it's only 4 days a week, so you're not having to do this every single day. Next we have health news that is, well, it's meant to be satirical, but if it were true, would actually be incredibly useful, and also somewhat terrifying, but useful first of all. It's a claim, basically, that HARP, or basically an evil corporation, that's going to be using drones to distribute vaccines by basically spraying them everywhere. And we point out that it's unlikely that you would aerosolize vaccines, simply because it doesn't really work. You might be able to make it function if there was a viral vector, you infect people, but then you have to have questions about dosage, efficacy, long-term issues, whether or not you're infecting non-targeted entities and organisms, and so on. So, yeah. However, that's not to say that this idea isn't incredibly useful. Partly because it would of course require that you have a very effective viral vector to infect all the people with the necessary vaccine things. But also, if this were taken slightly differently and you were to examine it in a more practical sense, having a single truck that you could load up with drones, let's say a nice large drone that's, unlike Ukrainian drones, not carrying high explosives, but instead, say, medicine. You can then deliver the requisite specific medicine for, say, individuals or large areas with that one truck. This would be incredibly helpful, and not just in places where logistics are a nightmare, such as parts of Africa, but also just in general senses. That is, let's say, you need your particular drug of choice, and it's not available except in particularly, let's say, developed or very concentrated areas of population. Well, pack one truck full of these drones and basically dedicate one drone to a person, and they can take their medication to them as the truck drives around. Then the drone goes back, docks itself, and presumably recharges, refills, and gets reloaded. It's a very efficient, very effective way of distributing medicine, if it was real, which sadly it's not. Shifting to something that isn't real, but also real, we have gluten intolerance and celiac disease. In short, gluten intolerance is a made-up fad. People do not have intolerance, it just doesn't exist. Celiac disease does exist. Now, we're probably going to get some kickback from this and people saying, well, I'm intolerant to it and I can prove that. Well, no, you can't, partly because that's anecdotal and anecdotal evidence is bullshit. But secondary to that is that actual research has shown intolerance does not exist. Most people who experience symptoms of some sort of discomfort after eating food containing gluten are not experiencing it because of the gluten. Instead, what they're experiencing discomfort from are FODMAPs. Now, we have an entire video dedicated to this, so we won't go into a great deal of detail, but in short, the difference is that FODMAPs are not gluten. They're generally found in the same foodstuffs, but they are not the same thing. Celiac disease is very much real. That is entirely an autoimmune disease, and that can be tested for more accurately now than previously, which does help considerably. So bear in mind that there is nothing sort of comparable between these. One is a completely unrelated condition that people inferentially associate incorrectly. In the other case, it's an actual diagnosable medical condition. Slightly similarly, let's say, theoretical is the effect that caffeine has in your brain while you sleep. Now, for a lot of people, caffeine is life. It allows you to function after you wake up. For other people, it's just something you enjoy. And for some individuals, it's something you drink all the time, even if you don't necessarily need to, or should. And this is mostly applicable to Americans and computer programmers, although computer programmers may also be consuming some sort of energy drink, so they're not exactly the targeted audience. What this research has found is that what caffeine does in your brain, particularly if you take it later at night and there's still a fairly active amount in your bloodstream, is it's going to alter how your brain operates as you sleep, if you're able to get to sleep at all. The research particularly noted that this is more significant in younger individuals, so early 20s through to late 20s. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that you should take this as gospel, let's say. Partly because it's based on 40 volunteers, so it's a small study. Obviously, volunteers means that they're self-selecting, and they're only running EEGs over 2 nights. So, yeah. The other important factor here is that because they only ran it over 2 nights, one with caffeine and one with the placebo, there's no, let's say, necessary adjustment here for issues like, say, adaptation and changes over time in the brains of the individuals that were actually affected. So if you were already doing this, you might find that those changes last longer than are obvious. Although again, not necessarily the case. If you want, the short answer to this is that caffeine does exactly what you would expect it to do if you're consuming it, which is it makes your sleep less restful. Unsurprisingly, it's intended to keep you awake, at least that's the effect we take it for. As such, seeing it reducing the efficacy of sleep, well, that's kind of like saying water is wet, because it's doing exactly what you expect it to do. In similar brain-related news, Rosemary, passing in time, wrong joke. This is just Rosemary. Can help your mind, particularly when it comes to things like Alzheimer's disease. Again, this is very preliminary, very, let's say, tenuous, let's call it that, research that you really shouldn't rely on as definitive proof of anything, but it's not necessarily going to do you much of any harm. The herb itself has very little effect other than smelling nice and tasting good in the right circumstances. So this could be helpful, could being the very operative word there, and a very important qualifier. The compound within rosemary that's supposed to help here is the 1,8-cineol. This helps to, let's say, preserve acetylcholine within your brain, and acetylcholine is a particularly important neurotransmitter. So theoretically, by keeping the brain able to communicate more effectively for longer, it remains more active, and therefore things like dementia, Alzheimer's disease and similar just take longer to get their effect. In theory, this could be a useful way of, let's say, slowing down the progress of neurodegenerative diseases like it, but probably not. In something that's not helpful at all, but somewhat hilarious, we have, chiropractors who are already quacks, and unironically identified by the quack detector, preaching that the use of hydrogen peroxide will cure cancer. The neck breakers are not someone to rely on for anything of the bloody kind. Anyway, hydrogen peroxide, otherwise known as effectively a bleaching agent, will not help your cancer. The only thing that will help your cancer is, 1, surgically removing it, because that will actually remove the cancerous growth. 2, some sort of drug that will stop the cancerous cells from multiplying, and or 3, having your immune system able to target said cancerous cells. Those are the 3 things that will do this. Everything else is quackery at the moment. So, no, putting 4 to 20 drops of hydrogen peroxide in a glass of water is going to make the water taste bad and do nothing more to help you. In other news related to animals, and this time something that is disappearing, we have emperor penguins and how they're disappearing, but disappearing faster than research thought they would. The loss of emperor penguins, as we mentioned earlier, could be considered a case of regicide. After all, killing any kind of royalty is just that. Well, regicide jokes aside, and they're probably going to keep them going for a while, involves satellite image assessment of colonies within Antarctica. So this is not necessarily the most ideal approach, but it could be useful. The research also is only focusing on about 1/3 of the total global emperor penguin population, so again, some concerns about how, let's say, accurate this is to the total population. If we're only looking about 1/3 of the population though, and only those colonies that were analysed, it's about 50% more advanced than they were expecting it to be at this same time based on previous models. There's been about a 22% decline in the 15 years leading up to 2024. The earlier estimate said that it should only be about 10%, so this is the concern there. One of the reasons is that the ice under the penguins' feet in the particular breeding grounds is thinning, and this partly leads to the loss of chicks who literally fall through the ice, and partly because, well, a lack of physical land for the eggs to be sat on. If you have no room, you can't sit on an egg. And if the egg happens to hatch and the chick happens to fall into the ice, well, they're not big enough to look after themselves at that point and they will freeze to death. So, if you're a fan of Happy Feet, this is not so happy. Again, bad jokes aside. In other animal news, although this time news that looks at the particular distribution of animals in a weird way. It's that there is effectively an imaginary line that separates Asia and Australia when we talk about animal kingdoms. It's kind of like, say, the Mason-Dixie line, where the North and South of America were divided, or the Danube in Europe, which basically separated out Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And we can come up with a bunch of other examples, but the imaginary line here is not so much important as it is a weird observation that is just about every kind of wild animal that lives in Eurasia, that is essentially Borneo, Indonesia, Vietnam, other countries over that side of the line, versus, say, Papua New Guinea, parts of Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and wherever else happens to be over that side in the Pacific Islands. They just don't cross this line, and they haven't done so for the better part of 30 million years. It's probably partly down to the fact that a lot of these places have evolved to survive with the idea of basically burning everything and seeing what survives. At least in Australia it does. In New Zealand, things are a little bit weirder, because New Zealand is like the Florida of Australia. Everything is weirder. Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, they're a bit different again, although they are more strange South America kinds of bizarre. Not necessarily everything and anything is trying to kill you kind of weird. Part of the separation for all of this is based on a very narrow area. It's about a 24 kilometer wide strait, let's say, that separates the narrowest parts of the islands involved in creating this bizarre phenomena. You might think that with what we've said, okay, well, animals don't cross over the line, but surely birds would fly over it, but bizarrely enough, not even birds seem to cross over this particular weird line. As such, you have two very distinct clusters of evolution that have occurred despite everything imaginable indicating that they should theoretically have at some point decided to move over. In other news that's slightly more promising, we have the benefits of dehorning rhinos, and arguably something we've always wondered why poachers don't do. Trimming the horns of rhinos and removing them has allowed for the rhino population to rather begin flourishing in parts of South Africa. Admittedly, only over 11 nature reserves, so bear in mind that this is not necessarily the most reliable of, let's say, studies, but it has reduced poaching by 78%, so we're not saying this is inefficient. What we've been confused about is quite simply, if you're a poacher, why would you kill the source of what you want? It kinda makes a lot more sense to go along, somehow sedate the rhinoceros, remove its horn while it's alive, and let it go back to what it's doing once it wakes up, because you can always come back again and get more horns. Whereas if you kill the rhinoceros, it's dead. You get one lot of horn out of it and no more. And it will take years for another rhinoceros to grow up to a size where it's at least marginally able to be of a horn size that is worth getting. And that assumes you don't just go along shooting any and all rhinoceroses you find, which means you're likely to collect a wide variety of sizes, and most of them probably aren't that useful. Plus, of course, it means you get to use a chainsaw to chop off a rhinoceros horn more regularly, which does sound kind of fun, but also kind of terrifying. It's not only a chainsaw, but a giant animal that if it wakes up and is angry at using a chainsaw on it is, yeah, it's a good way to wake them up, and they will not only be angry, but very angry and very groggy. In plant-related news, we have an effect that's effectively killing off one of the largest organisms in the world. Pando is a massive quaking aspen colony found in parts of the USA. It spreads across a fairly large area, about 106 acres, which is basically giant. What makes it very unique is that it is basically one giant colony, because it's all a clone of the original tree. What happens is that the original tree has at some point fallen over, the plant has remained alive despite falling over, and the branches that were there became new trunks. In turn, these eventually did basically something very similar, and it spread out from there. This is a huge issue, not just because, well, a giant clone of one tree, but the fact that it's gradually being eaten is a question. What's happening in particular here is that deer are what are targeting it. Young deer are finding that this giant clone, let's call it, is not only very tasty, but very prevalent, and that makes it very easy to eat it, partly because it's tasty, but also partly because, well, conveniently available. And young tender tree, well, most cases trunks, are very helpful. We remain, let's say, doubtful that this is going to be the end of the giant tree colony, mostly down to the fact that it's basically survived 14,000 years to date without ever dying, which there are very few things that have been in the world for 14,000 years and remain mostly, if not completely, intact. In the still plant-related news, but one that could be useful in drug discovery, whether we're talking about getting high or purely medical purposes, it's a fungus that can produce LSD. Now, this could be useful because the government might want to reawaken the MK Ultra experiments, or it could just be that, well, it could be useful in having a nice time, let's call it. The production of LSD in a natural format, that is, quite literally by a plant in this case, or a plant that carries a fungus and the fungus in turn produces it, is very interesting because LSD has, for the most part, been a synthetically generated drug up to and until now. What, let's say, directed this research into this particular plant and fungus pairing, and the fact it might carry LSD, is pretty much huge data, biochemical data, that indicated that Morningglory, ironically enough, might just well have a host fungus that through symbiosis could be producing an LSD, if not LSD-like product, that could theoretically be useful. Understand, they have found it, but how useful it is and, more importantly, how effectively it can produce LSD is not yet well established. Shifting to news now that toes the line between food and horror and explains why you should never let a mathematician be bored. A mathematician has calculated the size of what a giant meatball would be if every human on the world was used to make it. That is over 8 billion humans at the moment, which, yeah, that's a lot of humans, and obviously you get an equally huge, if not terrifyingly huge, meatball. Understand their research is a bit questionable, as we would sort of have an issue, let's say, with not just the size of humans, but also what the average body mass is. The human meatball would be about 1 kilometer wide, so that's already massive, and it would weigh a lot. Understand, we are talking about a stupid amount of weight. It's about 500 million metric tons. Now, you'd obviously have to have an equally large amount of sauce, and we question what that sauce would be, but also an equally large pot in which to cook this giant meatball. We're assuming that this doesn't include cannibals, as we can only assume they're the ones who would be consuming it. Going now to pure technology news, we have Apple claiming that they've not just proven, but can demonstrate that AI reasoning models like, say, ChatGPT, don't reason at all. Instead, they're just really good at memorizing patterns, which that's what a large language model really is. And to be clear about it, we have sustained the argument for quite a while now that none of these are AI. They cannot, in any way, shape, or form, act with any kind of independence of whatever they're being asked to do. For all intents and purposes, all you've really done is put a query in saying, find something that matches to this. If you were to, for example, ask ChatGPT, Grok, or whatever else you want to use, can you please do, and leave it very vague and open-ended, you'll get an equally vague and open-ended response because you've given crappy instructions. If, let's say for the sake of argument, they were true AI of some description, they would be able to say, okay, this is what you've asked for, but do you want to give me something more specific? Or they may even preemptively say, okay, that's vague, can you give me more specific instructions to operate on? Instead, they don't, because humans are, well, terrible at this sort of thing. It's why if you, say, get art commissions, if you're a designer or anything else, you have to deal with clients in exactly the same way. They say, I want to achieve X, but X is so vague that there's no actual instruction or, let's say, input on the final results. In news that will be useful, at least somewhere, sometime, physicists have made the world's tiniest violin. This can be used to mock people, but there is actually a good reason to make it. Possibly anyway. It's a tiny, tiny violin. We're talking about 13 microns wide? That's not quite, let's say, 1/12 to 1/15 the diameter of a human hair. So, really, really small. And the reason they've made it, you might think, okay, it's just stupidity, they're just doing it because they can, and no, scientists aren't doing something without asking if they should. There's actually a legitimate reason for it. They had to go through 4 steps. First of all, they needed a very tiny needle, and this is to make the pattern. Second, they needed essentially a computer chip that's coated with a polymer. That polymer is what can be used. Third, they had to then dissolve that polymer to expose what they were trying to write. Then, once they have this weird sort of dissolved state, the cavities in that polymer are filled with platinum, and this is what the tiny violin is made from, and partly why it's so damned expensive. And then ultimately, this allows the final step, which is removing it from their entire thing to make it, and that leaves behind a tiny violin. The tiny violin does not sadly play the saddest music in the world, because that would just be too perfect. Next we have a somewhat, let's say, satirical publication, although it's actually a real publication. Despite physicists, proof is essential in mathematics. Poking fun at the idea of, say, theoretical physics and similar, where you can basically set up an experiment and go, here's the calculation, but you don't actually prove that the calculation is what you say it is. The reason why proof is rather important is that even if you understand what the mechanism that you're using is, for example, in this case they use Pythagorean theorem, you still need to understand why it works. For example, if you measure 3 sides of a triangle, you know that if you do this, it does actually do what you say it does. But have you ever actually bothered to try that yourself? Take a triangle, make 3 squares that come off each side of it, and then try and figure out, okay, if you take the 2 squared sides, are they actually equal to what they look to be? And the answer should be yes. There should be importantly there. But yeah, it's interesting in that mathematics is taking potshots at physics now, which is possibly the prelude to some sort of civil war within the sciences, or some very, very sad fight. Finally, we have a killer asteroid that's going to hit the moon in 2032. The asteroid is described as being a city killer, and basically it's big enough that if it was to land on Earth, it would take out a fairly large city. The asteroid is named 2024 YR4, and in February of this year, it was expected to hit Earth, which, not cool. We like Earth, and we hope it doesn't hit our city. But now it's expected that it's not going to hit Earth. It has a very modest chance of hitting the moon, somewhere between 3.1% and 4.3%. So, modest. It's a 1 in 25 chance, more or less, anyway. And yeah, that's not very high, but if it does actually happen, theoretically we might even be able to see it, assuming it hits a visible side of the moon, and the moon is completely visible at the time. That with what is effectively another 7 or so years before the event is expected to occur, there is still ample time for that probability to be revised, and it may go up substantially, or it may fall to basically 0. That doesn't mean it won't happen, just that it's a very, very slim chance. If we do see its impact, you'll be aware that the actual size of it is between, say, 50 and 70 meters, somewhere between roughly 170 and 200-ish feet in freedom units. So that's big enough that, as mentioned, it could destroy a city. And if that's true, we should see a fair-sized impact on the moon, which would be a cool astronomical event to be able to observe. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.